so much for coming out tonight. I'm Priscilla Ross. I'm the Director of Business Development of Cooley Dickinson VNA Hospice, which is your sponsor of tonight's event. I do want to let everybody know that this is being recorded, and it will be on a website tomorrow. It'll be on North ASSOC, like North Street Association, so northasoc.org tomorrow morning. It looks like the cameras are going to be focused primarily on the panel, so if you don't want to be in it, chances are you won't be. But I just want to let you know that there will be a recording available online starting tomorrow, and then we will post it to our website when it's available after we've edited it. So why are we here tonight? This is part of a project that Cooley Dickinson VNA Hospice has been a part of for several years. We've been providing education to the community about end-of-life choices, palliative care, and hospice care, starting with Consider the Conversation several years ago. Every event has been well attended. Dr. Zesiger and Maureen Groden have been going out into the community, into just about every town out here, and providing education about palliative care and end-of-life choices. So this is a continuation of a series that we have been doing for the community for years. It's also a passion that we have, and that clearly this community has. It was also prompted by the Dignity Project from the Daily Hampshire Gazette, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, which was launched in February of 2014 with a forum at JFK Middle School. We're very thankful to the Gazette for having the courage to document these, to produce the series and to document Lee Hawkins' life and death. We're very thankful for Lee for making her choices known and public, and to Sue for being here. Many things have brought many of us here today. Brittany Maynard, I'm sure, is in many people's minds, the young woman out in Oregon who had to move to Oregon to choose the death that she wanted. Lee Hawkins is on our minds. And we're here to just continue the conversation and encourage our community to engage in this conversation beyond these community forums that are available occasionally. I want to thank Tim Kirk, who is our presenter tonight, the Daily Hampshire Gazette, Laurie and Carol and Sue and Jeff, the Northampton Senior Center, Adam Cohen, and the North Street Association for recording. A few things. Please make sure that you turn off your cell phones. We have handed out index cards and pens for you to write your questions down. We have one mic, so we will take the questions from your index cards, and actually we found that this works better. It gives people who might not want to stand up and ask a question a chance to ask questions, and we can answer more questions this way because a lot of times they are similar in nature, so we can group them and make sure we get as many of the questions covered. Bathrooms are through that hallway that you came in. On the left, you may need to push the little button on the left when you walk in there, but they should be sensitive to motion. And I also want to thank Trista Peria, who is here from the VNA Hospice, for her help with setting up the space. So we're looking forward to this night. I think it's going to prove to be another thoughtful and thought-provoking evening. I want to introduce Maureen Groden, who is the Director of Hospice and Palliative Care of Cooley Dickinson Healthcare. She is not only a very knowledgeable and passionate woman, and a great director, but she's also a very kind person. And I'm really, really lucky to work with her. Before she takes the mic, though, I do want to add that this series, tonight's event, has been made possible by a gift from Planned Giving. So a donor donated money to our organization. He requested it and in his will, and because of the money from this gift, we were able to put on this event and have an expert like Tim Kirk come up from New York to speak. So there are envelopes at the back of the room on the table, along with most forms and resources. If you feel moved, please feel free to donate to our organization. That's the last you'll hear about that, but it is through those gifts that we can provide services like this to our community. So, Maureen.
Thank you. I feel really grateful to be part of a community that's able and willing to have these conversations. I think that these are matters of living and dying and finding meaning in life, and I'm really privileged to be a part of it. I want to tell you about the format for this evening. I'll introduce our keynote speaker, who will be speaking for about 20 to 30 minutes on ethics in general, and also voluntary stopping of eating and drinking particularly. And then each of the panelists will have a few minutes to talk about what brings them here. And then we'll take questions from the audience. So I'd like to start by introducing the panel. First of all is Dr. Jeffrey Zesiger. He is a palliative physician at Cooley Dickinson Hospital. He's also our medical director of our VNA and hospice programs. I always say that Jeff epitomizes bedside manner. I also want you to know that Jeff is willing to go to whatever length to help people to reach their goals. And I think the case with the Hawkins family is an example of his willingness to do whatever the family wanted. And that's pretty courageous in this particular instance. We're really grateful to have Sue Hawkins to Dr. Zesiger's right. Sue is the daughter of Lee Hawkins and primary caregiver who took care of Lee during the process of her dying. Lee is the person that was written about recently in the paper who chose to stop eating and drinking. She was on our hospice program, was terminally ill, and chose to end her life sooner by stopping eating and drinking. And so thank you so much, Sue, for being here with us tonight. And then Laurie Loisel is from the daily Hampshire Gazette. She is an editor who wrote the 3-part series about Lee Hawkins. And then to her right is Carol Lollis, who is the photographer who chronicled the journey of the Hawkins family. So thank you all very much for being with us. And at this time, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. It's Dr. Timothy Kirk. He writes and consults on ethical questions in hospice and palliative care. He's an assistant professor of philosophy at the City University of New York. And when we were first presented with Lee's situation, we wanted to do what was right. We wanted to be thoughtful. We wanted to look at it from multiple angles. We wanted to help the family to do what they wanted to do, but we also wanted to do what was right. And so I contacted the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization, who connected me with Dr. Kirk. Dr. Kirk consulted with us. We had a conference call with him, and it helped us tremendously. So I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you for that. And I'd also like to welcome and introduce you to Dr. Timothy Kirk.
Hi. So it's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. Usually I wander when I talk, but there are 2 things that will prevent that from happening tonight. One is that we're being recorded. The other is that the microphone cord is about 8 feet long. So I'll stay here, but know that I would rather be out there with you. And I'd rather be out there with you because while Maureen was very generous in saying that together we thought about the appropriate questions to ask when someone requests to stop eating and drinking to hasten their death, I don't know that I offered anything in the way of answers to those questions. And that's partly from my training. I'm trained as a philosopher, and philosophers have the least marketable skill sets on the planet. They're taught how to ask really hard questions with no expectations whatsoever of answering them. But it's also because of the nature of the questions themselves. It's not as if the questions that we're asking here together tonight, the questions that were asked by the family and the care team this past summer, or indeed any questions at the end of life that are asked recently, are being asked for the first time. We have records of the ancient Egyptians asking the same kind of questions. We have writings from the ancient Greeks asking the same kinds of questions. Some of the first Chinese novels were about these kinds of questions. These are questions that come along, really, with being a human being. In other words, being a human being is largely about asking questions, and frustratingly, less about coming up with answers to those questions. But that having been said, what I've been tasked with tonight is to try to think together with you to come up with a framework through which to ask questions about ethics and the end of life. And if you saw the brochure that was put out, it laid out 3 of those questions, and I'm going to try to use those questions to offer some brief opening remarks in until we get to the more interesting part of tonight, which is considering your questions and talking with you about possible responses to those. So the title of tonight's session is Ethics and Choices at the End of Life. And then there were 3 questions outlined underneath that. The first is, how do we, A, ensure that our end-of-life wishes are honored, B, provide support when we're struggling with choices made. So to clarify that question, I think, is to say something like this. When our loved ones are the ones who are dying, and they've made choices that are really not consistent with the values that we hold personally, how do we do 2 things simultaneously? On the one hand, how do we give them the care that we want to give them because we love them? And on the other hand, how do we sit with this discomfort and disagreement when the care that we're giving them may be aligning with choices that we just don't think are right? And that could be because we're people actually in the home giving care to them. That could be because we're neighbors and we know what's going on. Or that could just be because we're in the town and we're reading about it in the paper. How do we, on the one hand, express love, support, and empathy for people who are vulnerable, on the other hand, remain steadfast and stand up for what we believe is right? And then the third question is, how do we address when there are these differences? How do we address them with respect and empathy? So notice the assumption here then is that they will be addressed. You don't simply swallow that discomfort and ignore it. Part of the goal of tonight, in fact, is to acknowledge and address disagreement, to try to figure out how to proceed together in the face of such disagreement, which is why I really like how each question opens. Each question opens, how do we? So the assumption is that we're all in this together. As colleagues, as family members, as friends, as a town. And one of the things that the hospice team was wrestling with over the summer when I got to know them was, how do we as a care team, since we view ourselves as a hospice care team as a partner with the patient and family, how do we move ahead even though some of us have questions about what's going on here? And how do we figure out what the right thing is to do for the patient? How do we figure out how to honor some of the disagreements that are there even amongst family members? And how do we honor care team members who may not be comfortable with the way this particular case is progressing? So with that as the set of questions that we are assigned to think about tonight, I want to suggest to you that there are 3 foundational questions, or say 3 philosophical questions, that if we address them might give us a nice starting point, if we all agree on the meaning of some terms and where we're beginning. So in particular, since the title of tonight's program is called Ethics and Choices at the End of Life, I thought it might be helpful to at least lay out one version of just what ethics is. Ethics is one of those words that I haven't met anyone in this country who doesn't feel fully qualified to talk very loudly in public about ethics. It's kind of like when you go to New York and you ask people which is the better baseball team, the Mets or the Yankees. I've never met anyone who doesn't have an opinion on that, and that declares that opinion with the confidence of an expert, even though, like me, they may have just moved there the year before. So what is ethics? What is this thing that we all think we know what it is? And the second is, how is ethics connected to choices? Because the title of tonight is Ethics and Choices at the End of Life. Is there a necessary relationship between ethics and choices? And then the third is, how are ethics and choices important at the end of life? I promise that the way that I hope to address these questions, it's going to be more interesting than the questions themselves may have just sounded, judging from the expressions on your faces. So, let's think about the first. What is ethics? Because right off the bat, I think we see a connection between ethics and choices. There are certain conditions that need to be in place for ethics to even be relevant. And one of those conditions needs to be the presence of options. Questions are not ethical questions when there are no options to consider. So if there's only one way forward, no one stops to ask what the right course of action is. There's only one way forward. People will only stop and begin asking ethical questions when there are at least 2 options. So actually, ethics and choice, they're fundamentally related. We assume, really, that if we're asking ethical questions, the implication is that there's more than one choice to make. Right? So there are options. That's a fundamental condition for ethics. The next fundamental condition for ethics is really the idea that not only are there options, but the people involved in the decision-making process, they need to have the freedom to choose one of those options over against the other. So it can't be the case, really, that there are three options, but you're only able to choose one. That's not really putting someone in a position where they have any moral autonomy to make a choice. So there have to be options, but there also needs to be a certain amount of freedom to choose amongst those options. Otherwise, we can't hold anyone responsible for their choice. They're not morally culpable. Not only does there need to be the freedom to choose amongst those options, but there needs to be the ability to choose amongst those options. So there can be many options. There can be freedom to choose among options, but if someone doesn't have the capability to choose among options, again, it doesn't really make sense to say that they're morally praiseworthy or blameworthy. How about blameworthy? Yeah, for those choices. So the example here might be my dog, Lily. So Lily's a French bulldog. She's 4 years old. She just had back surgery that if I told you how much it cost, you would question my sanity, because I question my sanity when I get the bill. But anyhow, one of the results of Lily's back surgery is that she's no longer allowed to jump on and off furniture, because it's suspected that that's one of the things that caused her back problem to begin with. So I brought Lily home from the hospital and I explained to her that it's really not a good idea to jump off the couch anymore, because this is how she ended up in the hospital. She didn't really like being in the hospital. So the first two conditions are there. She has options, and she has the freedom to choose amongst those options. But it's the third condition that's not there. She doesn't have the cognitive capacity to take what I've told her and then make a decision about whether or not she wants to jump off the couch. She's been jumping off the couch all her life, and she continues to jump off the couch. So all three have to be there. Otherwise, we really can't say that someone is accountable morally for the choices that they've made. So those are some fundamental assumptions, some conditions that need to be there for ethics to be relevant at all. Now, what's the connection then between ethics and choices? Because we can make choices, even if we're accountable for those choices. We can make choices in ways other than using ethics. We can make choices based on what we feel like. We can make choices based on what seems most appealing to us today. We can make choices based on someone's going to pay me a lot of money to make this choice. So there are some particular ways in which choices are made, and those particular ways have to be engaged for them to be considered ethical choices. What's one of them? Well, one of them is that because we have these different ways to make choices, ethical choices are choices that are based on values. And values are actually remarkably simple. Values are things that we think are important. Right? So if one of my values, say, is honesty, I simply think that it's preferable and more important to be honest than not honest. If one of my values is fidelity, then I think it's important for me or for my spouse to not go to bed with other people. And I prefer that over a spouse who goes to bed with other people. Values is a part of ethical decision-making, and values are simply things that we hold out there as preferable to their opposite. If there are certain values, though, that we think are so important that we're going to allow them to guide our lives, that we're going to allow them to be the things that we look to when we make important decisions in our lives, we give these values what philosophers would call normative weight. So in other words, values that have these normative weight, they set norms. These are things that we think it makes sense about these things to use words like should and ought. So if something like fidelity is important to me in a spouse, and it's not just important to me as a preference, but it's important to me because I'm really going to say that my spouse is doing something wrong if she's not faithful to me. Well, then I've just given that value something more than a preference. I've given it this normative weight. I've said that this is something that should guide behavior for me and for other people who are in relationships with me. Another way to think about this outside of special relationships is to think about different categories of relationships. So in general, it tends to be the case that we value the welfare of friends over the welfare of strangers. Now, this is not some fundamental human truth. There are those who don't. But if you're walking down the street and on this side of the street someone collapses and they're your friend, and on this side of the street someone collapses and they're not your friend, they're a total stranger, most people would choose to help the friend first. Now, if that's true, to the extent to which you expect your friends, if they're in a similar situation, to help you first, then you've started to assign normative weight to that value. You've said, in other words, I think for my friends, they have an obligation to treat me preferentially. And if they don't, they're not a good friend. So if we make decisions using values, and if we assign values this normative weight, such that we think it's right to act in ways consistent with the values, but wrong to act in ways that aren't consistent with them, well, then we're moving down the line of not just decision-making, but ethical decision-making. So if we give these values normative weight, we call them moral values. And then ethics is really just the process of collecting these moral values together, trying to make sense of how we're going to integrate them in our lives, and being able to explain and justify them to others. So someone begins to ask you, oh, well, what's your position on this issue? What's your position on that issue? You're able to declare not just a series of preferences, but you're able to explain, well, here's why I think this is the right thing to do for me and for other people in my life. Or here's why I think this is the right thing to do for me, but I don't as much care what other people do. So one way then to define ethics and ethical decision-making is decision-making that uses values. Values that we have given this normative weight. We think it makes sense to tell ourselves anyway that we should or should not act in accord to these values. And when we have enough of these values and we put them together in a way that makes sense, all of a sudden we have an ethical point of view. And in fact, most people that I joked about a few minutes ago who feel very comfortable expressing an ethical point of view, they do have that. They may not have taken the time to sit down and unpack what the values are or how they fit together, but they have it. So the suggestion, in other words, is that all of us, because our lives are made up of decisions that we have to engage in every day, you have to decide whether or not to come here, whether or not to stop at the red light on the way here, whether or not to stop at the stop sign. Somebody, as I was crossing the road here, even though they didn't have a stop sign, stopped and waved for me across. That's how I knew I wasn't in New York City anymore. Right? So there are all these kinds of decisions that are made. Right? Some of these decisions are just preferences. Right? This is the kind of town you want to live in, where people slow down and let other people cross. Right? Some of them move beyond preferences to decisions that are made on moral values. You actually think that's the right thing to do, and you begin to shake your head when you see someone else not do it. Some of them are values that are so important to you that you've collected them together and they're part of your point of view. And they would inform perhaps who you choose to enter into relationships with, what kind of faith or community groups you choose to join or to leave, who you vote for in elections. So we're very experienced actually with ethical decision making. So the third question then is, how does all of this connect to the end of life? Because it seems like, at least in healthcare ethics, all of the literature focuses on the beginning of life and then the end of life. So if you ever see folks who claim to be bioethicists, whatever that means, on TV, they're almost always talking about something at the very beginning of life or something at the very end of life. So this Brittany Maynard case, it was a gold rush for bioethicists who like to see themselves on TV. And everyone's interviewing people asking, is what she did right or wrong? Now, it's not a bad question to ask. Similarly, when there are folks at the very beginning of life, this was more so in the 80s and 90s, but babies, say, who were born with severe handicaps, or mothers who were thinking about selectively reducing pregnancies when they were pregnant with 4, 5, 6 fetuses. All of a sudden, again, there's this rush of bioethics types on the TV. And it's not exactly clear to me why all of the bioethics literature and why all the ethics discussions in the media focus around the beginning of life and the end of life. And it's especially not clear to me because the last I checked, most of us live most of our lives in between those two moments. Right? Which suggests then that we shouldn't think about the beginning of life separately from life. We shouldn't think about the end of life separately from life. What connects all these things is you and me. Right? All of us here had a beginning of life. Do you remember the age you were when you figured out that in order to be here on the planet, your parents had to have had sex? Do you remember how traumatic that was to think about that? And then you might have now gotten to the age where your kids are making the same discovery. Right? And then you think then that not only is it true that everyone comes here in the same way, but everyone leaves here in the same way too. I hope I'm not the first one to tell you all that we're not here forever. We're going to die. So in fact, instead of being a period of life at the beginning and a period of life at the end that should drive us apart, which is what it tends to do when it's talked about in the media, it should be the thing that brings us all together, right? Because we're all born and we all die. It's something that we all have in common. It's a wonderful place to start from. Doesn't mean we have to agree on the best conditions in which to be born or the best conditions in which to die, but it is something we're all going to experience. I really can't think of anything else that I know everyone in this room has experienced birth and will experience death. So what I would encourage us to do tonight then is to not think about ethical decisions at the end of life as somehow separate or discrete from all of the other ethical decisions we have to make across our lives. It's part of the same process. We make these decisions every day. Some of them we make guided by our moral values, and that process can continue all the way up until the moment of death. And if you read this series of articles in the local paper over the summer, that was one of the interesting things to me about the series, is that the idea was that Ms. Hawkins, as she got to the end of her life, was making decisions about how she wanted to die. If the paper was accurate, she was making decisions in the same way that she made decisions about other things in her life throughout the course of her life. That there was not this radical break at the end of life that all of a sudden she started making decisions in a different way. And that suggests to me that there was an effort there, and it sounds like a successful effort, for integrity. Right? In other words, to keep the same values and the same process going from the beginning till the end. To acknowledge differences and changes when they happen, but to not think about the end as separate from the rest of life. So, on the one hand, it sounds really easy, doesn't it, to say that decisions at the end of life then should just be made in the same way that decisions throughout life are. But in fact, they're not. So just a word about why they may not be. And then I think we'll hear from the panel and from you all about that. So why is it then that decisions at the end of life feel so different than decisions that are made throughout the course of life? So I'll offer three possibilities there. One is that while we may be very clear about our values as we live our lives, and we may be very comfortable in exploring and discovering what they are as we move through our teens and our 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, very few of us, unless we have some significant chronic illness, very few of us have experience translating those life values into complicated healthcare decisions. So we may have used those values to figure out where to go to school. We may have used those values to figure out who to marry. We may have used those values to figure out who to divorce. There are decisions that we have made throughout our lives, and we have kind of stumbled through the process of translating our values into making those decisions. But very few people have the experience of making really complicated healthcare decisions amongst very complicated interventions over the course of their lives before the last 2 to 5 years of life. So one reason that decisions about the end of life may feel so different is that most of us don't have the experience of making complicated healthcare decisions before the last 2 to 5 years of life. A second reason that making decisions at the end of life may feel so different is that it's an expected part of the dying process that most of us, as we get closer to death, will begin to lose decision-making capacity. As it's the case that deaths from heart disease begin to dwindle and deaths from complications related to Alzheimer's disease begin to increase, what it means to make decisions at the end of life changes because who's making those decisions changes. instead of being able to speak for ourselves, as we become less aware of what's going on, less able to process and predict, say, the consequences of our choices, family members and loved ones begin to support us in decision making and then may take over in making decisions. And you know what? Taking over and making decisions for someone else, that's just hard. So we, for 30 years now, have had these various methods of advanced care planning and have taught people how to coach loved ones to make the decisions they want. We've taught loved ones how to try to make decisions in the best interests of the people who are dying. But there's no getting around the idea that it's a really hard thing to do. It's partly a really hard thing to do because most of the models we use, advanced directives, MOLST, POLST, they're highly cognitive models. In other words, we assume that people will make rational choices. And most of these models have been designed by physicians, lawyers, and people like me, philosopher bioethicists, who sit in rooms and come up with perfect ways to do things. The trouble is, right, is so then you're teaching family members, loved ones, and patients. You're talking to them when you're explaining these options. You're talking to their cerebral cortex, their higher brain function. Right? But they're hearing through their limbic system. They're hearing emotionally. They're hearing through their gut. Because most of these conversations start too late. They start when people are already very emotional about some unexpected change in a health condition. There are already, many of them, in the process of anticipatory grief. So there's a disconnect between how we teach people how to make these decisions and how they actually make these decisions. There's a literal disconnect. They're using entirely different parts of the brain. The last reason it may seem more difficult to make decisions at the end of life than it did even a generation ago is that there are just a lot more options now than there were a generation ago. So if you think back to even 40 or 50 years ago, certainly there was CPR back then, right? And there were some really successful interventions for infectious disease. But the idea that you had really finely tuned opportunities to intervene and support someone's pulmonary system, or you had really powerful drugs that could go in and elevate someone's blood pressure in a way that keeps the blood circulating throughout their body. A generation or two ago, those just weren't options. When your body began to shut down and the heart and the lungs began to shut down, that was it. So there were no ethical decisions to make because there were no choices available. Now we can keep bodies alive, well, a long time past when our loved ones looked like who we remember them looking like. So with the increase in options and choices comes an increase in complexity in the decision-making process. So that's an effort then to lay a foundation to think about, first, what is ethics? Second, what's the connection between ethics and choices? And the answer is that ethics really doesn't become relevant until there are choices. And then third, what's the connection between ethics and choices at the end of life? So that all gives us, I hope, at least one way to be using a common language when we begin to reflect on the three questions that are left for us to think about then. What can we do to ensure that our wishes are honored? How can we provide support and comfort when we may disagree with choices that our loved ones are making? And how can we address differences with respect and empathy? So I think that the answers, or some answers to those questions, will come out as we hear from the panel and as we respond to your questions. So maybe I'll turn it back over. Do I turn it over to Jeff now? Okay. So thanks for your attention, and we'll switch things over then to Jeff, who's the hospice medical director.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was really great. So Priscilla's reminding me, if you're starting to write out questions, please go ahead and do them, and we'll come around in the aisles and pick them up as the program goes on. So if we miss a question, just wave a card, we'll see you. Thanks again, Tim. I've been on the ethics committee at Cooley Dickinson for a number of years, and we do lots of ethical consults, but that was a great way to think about it that I had never heard before. So you can always learn new things. I wanted to just speak for a couple minutes to say that, well, how does this touch me? How does my work really give me energy? And I would say it's listening to your stories. Your stories are what make me want to go to work every day. Your dilemmas make me want to think harder, bring in other people on the team. How can we help? And eventually try to get some answers. So there's not always an easy answer, but if I hear what your wishes are, what your values are, then I start to get an idea. And I think everybody on the VNA, people up at Cooley Dickinson, people on the hospice team, we're all more and more interested in doing this, and I've noticed our community is getting much more highly tuned to share things with each other. And we have new ways of doing it, and I would say that there are lists now more and more on the internet. If you find somebody's talking to you cerebrally, as Tim mentioned, but your heart is what you're really making a decision based on, there's lots of different ways to learn these things, the decision making, finding out what your values are, whether it's 5 wishes or planning for your care. There are lots of different websites now that are trying to do it in different ways, video ways, pictorial ways. We even have one that's a deck of cards that we got, and you put the cards on a table and you move them into 3 piles. One is, this is important to me. That one's not. And in the middle, I'm not sure. And at the end, you just kind of look and say, wow, I've really put my values right on the table. So there's a lot of new ways coming up. People are clever and they're bringing this to us. But it all gets down to a conversation, all gets down to hearing your stories. So I'm glad to be able to work in medicine now. There's so much change. People are really looking at these things. And if you look at one of the pink forms in the back of the room, the MOLST form, when that came out, that looked like, oh, this is going to be terrible. And it turns out it's really good because it helps us walk through a lot of these choices, this advanced care planning that once you have a serious illness, you should be thinking about. So I think that's all I wanted to share tonight, and I will pass the baton over. Sue, are you ready for us?
Hi there. Can you hear me? Sort of as our process went on and as our family made it into your daily paper, I sort of thought, well, what is it that's so, why do we belong, why do we own your newspaper for a few days in a row? And I know that there are some people in the community that still wonder that. And I think when I think about our situation from the inside out is that my mom was remarkable in making a choice that most people don't make in a very conscious way. And at the same time, we were incredibly ordinary. There was nothing particularly remarkable. As a matter of fact, her death was probably a lot easier than many people's deaths. And everybody has a story at the death of loved ones. And it's something that, as Tim said, we don't tend to talk about, and we don't tend to weave it into the fabric of our lives. And so I'm hoping that if we did one thing, it's getting death and choices sort of at the dinner table. And I think that's one of the things you said when you have a serious illness, that it's time to start thinking about. And I think I could hear my mom saying, oh no, way before that. Is just to be thinking about where we're heading before we're right there. And in my perfect scenario, Mom would still be here. She'd lived forever. I miss her every day when it gets to be the time that I would call her. But somehow holding maybe somewhere around 80 years old and still able to fully engage and to be independent in all of the facets of her life. But she had gotten to the point where that wasn't possible, and she decided that she really needed to make a choice. And she had passed the point of being able to live independently. And her lines were relatively clear about quality of life. She also felt like it was a social justice issue. Why should she burn up all of her, I don't know what the statistics are, but an incredible amount of her healthcare dollars in her last few years? And that was really a personal choice for her. And I say it was clear, but it was sort of clear. And it was clear when it was in the future. And it helped all of us to have spoken about quality of life and end of life over the years when it wasn't a burning issue. We weren't afraid as she was talking about it. We weren't, we could even joke about it because it was far enough out in the future. It wasn't something that we were facing today. So we kind of had a family understanding in a way that I think many families don't. And so for her, it's like